Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's strangest experiments in masculinity. Picture this. It's 5:47 on a frozen January morning in 1876. You're 11 years old. You've just been ripped from sleep by a brass bell clanging through stone corridors so cold you can see your own breath curling in the darkness. You shuffle downstairs in a thin nightshirt, feet numb on freezing flagstones, and then you reach the washroom. Row after row of ceramic basins, each one filled the night before, each one topped with a solid sheet of ice. You're required to break that ice with your bare fist, strip naked, and wash your entire body in water cold enough to stop your heart. This isn't punishment. This isn't some Victorian torture experiment. This is breakfast preparation at Harrow School, one of the most prestigious institutions in England. And here's the part that will keep me up tonight. The teachers genuinely believed this was kindness. They genuinely believed freezing their students every morning was the only way to save their souls. For the next hour, I'm going to tell you how an entire generation of Victorian men was systematically trained to worship discomfort. How they learned to see suffering not as something to avoid, but as something to seek out. How they convinced themselves that pain purified, and how that lesson didn't die in the 19th century. It moved into your gym. It infected your office. It lives in the voice in your head that says you should be working harder, enduring more, complaining less. If you're lying in bed right now, with the lights dim and the world quiet, and you want to understand why modern masculinity still can't ask for help, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe before we go deeper. Drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are, because I want to prove something tonight. We're all scattered across different time zones, different lives, but we're about to share the same freezing washroom together. Let me take you inside Harrow School on a January morning in 1881. Not the Harrow of postcards and prestige, not the Harrow of future prime ministers and poets. The other Harrow, the one they didn't put in the brochures, the one that existed before dawn when the world belonged only to cold and children. Thomas arrived here 4 months earlier, in September, when England still pretended winter wasn't coming. He arrived with a new trunk, new clothes, new hopes. His mother had cried at the train station. His father had shaken his hand and said the words every Victorian father said, "Make me proud, boy. Become a man." Thomas didn't know yet what becoming a man would cost. He learned in January. The dormitory, where Thomas sleeps, has 30 iron beds packed so close the boys can hear each other breathing. The windows stay open all night, every night, because the headmaster read somewhere that fresh air prevents moral decay. Never mind that the air is 22 degrees and carries frost. Never mind that the blankets are thin wool, worn smooth by decades of other shivering boys. Thomas sleeps in his clothes most nights, though he'd never admit it. If the prefects caught him, he'd be punished. Not for breaking a rule exactly, for showing weakness, for admitting the cold could touch him. At 5:47 a.m., the bell begins. It's not a gentle bell. It's brass, and it's loud, and it crashes through stone corridors like judgment. Thomas has learned to wake 1 second before it rings, his body already braced for what comes next. He swings his legs from under the blanket. The stone floor hits his bare feet like a slap. He's wearing only a thin nightshirt, because proper boys don't sleep in clothes, no matter how cold. He shuffles toward the door with the others. 40 boys in white nightshirts moving through darkness like ghosts. No one speaks. Speaking would require energy they don't have. Speaking might wake them up enough to feel what's coming. The washroom is a long stone chamber with high ceilings and narrow windows that show only black. Along both walls, ceramic basins sit on wooden stands. 40 basins. Filled last night by servants who don't have to use them in the morning, and on top of each basin, a solid sheet of ice. Not thin ice, thick ice. Ice that formed over 8 hours of freezing. Thomas approaches his assigned basin. The boy next to him, a new boy who arrived after Christmas, starts crying already, quietly. The way boys cry when they've learned loud crying brings worse. Thomas doesn't look at him. Looking at him would mean acknowledging the tears, and acknowledging tears makes them real. Thomas raises his right hand, looks at it for a moment, a child's hand. Small knuckles, soft skin. Then he brings it down on the ice. The shock runs up his arm. The ice cracks, but not enough. He hits it again, until his fist breaks through and plunges into water so cold it burns. For a few seconds, he can't feel his fingers. Then the pain arrives. Not the sharp pain of injury. The deep, bone-level pain of cold that reaches somewhere primitive. Thomas doesn't pause. He scoops water with both hands, splashes it over his chest. His chest seizes. His lungs forget how to work. For 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5, he cannot breathe. The world narrows to ice and skin, and the animal panic that says, "Stop, stop, this is killing you." But Thomas keeps going. He was taught that the body lies, that the panic is weakness, that real boys, real men, override the animal with the will. He washes his face, his arms, his legs, every inch. The water runs down his body, and for one horrible moment, it feels warm against his skin, because his skin is now colder than the water. That's the trick the body plays. That's when boys break. When cold stops feeling cold and starts feeling like something worse. Thomas doesn't break. He reaches for the rough towel, dries himself with quick mechanical movements. His skin is purple. His hands shake so badly he almost drops the towel. But his face shows nothing. Nothing at all. Because here's what Thomas has already learned in just 4 months. The cold is not the real test. The real test is what happens after. When he walks to breakfast in his uniform, hair still damp, skin still burning as it warms. When a master asks if he's quite well, and Thomas says, "Yes, sir," in a steady voice. When another boy mentions how cold the water was, and Thomas says nothing, because saying anything would mean admitting it affected him. The real test is making your face a mask so perfect that no one ever knows what lies behind it. The real test is learning to suffer and smile, or not smile, just exist, just endure, just become the boy who feels nothing, because feeling everything is not permitted. By the time Thomas reaches the dining hall, his body has stopped shaking. By the time he eats his cold porridge standing at a wooden bench, his fingers have stopped hurting. By the time morning lessons begin, he has already forgotten, almost, that this morning was different from any other morning. Almost. There's a part of him that remembers. A part that will always remember. But that part has already learned to stay very, very quiet. That's what the ice is really for, not the body. The ice is for that quiet part. The ice is to teach it, day after day, year after year, that its voice is not welcome here. And the ice always wins. Because the ice has time. The ice has tradition. The ice has every headmaster and every prefect and every father who ever shook a small hand and said, "Become a man." The ice has all of them. And Thomas, for now, has only himself. Which is exactly how they want it. Which is exactly how men are made. But here's the thing about making men this way. Here's what the headmasters never understood. When you teach a boy to silence the part of himself that feels cold, you also teach him to silence the part that feels anything else. The part that might someday need to say, "I'm lonely," or "I'm scared," or "I don't know if I can do this." That part goes quiet too. That part learns to hide so deep that even the boy himself forgets where it lives. And then one day, 20 years later, that boy is a man standing in some freezing outpost of empire or some lonely London office. And he cannot, for the life of him, remember how to feel anything at all. The ice did its job too well. The ice made him free. Free from cold, free from pain, free from everything that makes a person human. That's the trade they never mention. That's the price of becoming a man the Victorian way. And Thomas, standing in that freezing washroom at 6 a.m. in January 1881, has just made his first payment. The question Thomas never asked, not out loud anyway, was the question that haunted every boy in that washroom. Why? Why was this normal? Why did fathers send sons here, knowing what waited? Why did mothers kiss them goodbye at train stations and never mention the ice? Why did an entire civilization agree that 11-year-old boys should wake in darkness and wash in water cold enough to stop their hearts? The answer, when you dig through the letters and the manuals and the headmaster's speeches, is stranger than you'd think. They didn't do this because they were cruel. They did this because they were terrified. Terrified of something they couldn't name but could feel coming. Something that threatened everything they believed about themselves and their country and their God. And the ice, the freezing water, the open windows, the silent breakfasts, the ink freezing in the wells, all of it was their desperate attempt to fight that terror by freezing it out of existence. You have to understand what England looked like from the inside in the 1870s and 80s. From the outside, it looked like victory. The British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's land. British ships ruled every ocean. British factories produced more than any others. British gold backed the world's currencies. But from the inside, from the drawing rooms and the gentlemen's clubs and the boarding school headmaster's studies, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like fragility. It looked like everything they'd built could collapse if the men running it weren't hard enough, tough enough, cold enough to hold it together. The empire needed men who could go to India and not go native. Men who could survive Africa and not flinch. Men who could govern Canada's frozen expanses and not complain about the cold. And where, the headmasters asked themselves, where would such men come from? Not from comfortable homes with warm beds and loving mothers. Not from houses where servants brought hot water for washing. Those places produced soft men, weak men. Men who would crumble the moment empire demanded something real. The only place hard men came from was hard places, so they built hard places. They built schools where comfort was the enemy and suffering was the curriculum. There was a doctor, a man named James Cantley, who wrote books that headmasters read aloud to each other. Cantley believed, genuinely believed, that cold water bathing was essential for moral development. Warm baths, he wrote, made boys listless and prone to vice. Hot water softened the will the way it softened the skin. But cold water, ice water, water that shocked the system and stopped the breath, that strengthened something deeper. It purified not just the body, but the soul. Cantley's books sold thousands of copies. Other doctors agreed. Educators nodded. Parents, reading this, felt reassured that the suffering they'd endured as boys had meaning. That the ice they'd broken with their own fists had made them who they were. And so they sent their sons to do the same. And the cycle continued. And the terror that drove it all stayed carefully hidden beneath theories about character and discipline and the needs of empire. But the terror was always there. You can feel it in the letters fathers wrote. Not the ones they published, but the private ones that survive in archives. My dear boy, one father wrote to his son at Harrow in 1883. I hope you are finding the routine bracing. I remember my own mornings at rugby with something approaching fondness now. Though I confess, I did not feel fond at the time. It is strange how discomfort remembered becomes comfort. How pain past becomes proof. You will understand one day. Proof of what? The father doesn't say. Proof that you belong to something larger than yourself. Proof that you can be trusted with the weight of empire. Proof that you are not soft, not weak, not one of those boys who breaks instead of bends. The proof is the pain itself. The pain proves you survived it. The pain proves you're still standing. The pain proves you're one of us. And this was the genius of the system. It made boys prove themselves over and over every morning, every winter, every year, until the proving became automatic. Until they didn't need the headmasters anymore because they'd internalized the headmaster completely. Until the voice that said, endure, don't complain, this is making you a man, lived inside them, speaking in their own voice, so that even alone, even in the dark, even when no one was watching, they kept proving, kept suffering, kept telling themselves it meant something. The ice wasn't just water. The ice was the empire's last line of defense against its own collapse. And every boy who broke it with his fists was defending something he couldn't name from a threat he couldn't see. That's what Thomas was really doing at 6 a.m. in that freezing washroom. He was holding the empire together with his frozen hands. He just didn't know it yet. None of them did. They only knew the water was cold and they had to get in. The reasons, the terror, the desperate philosophy behind it all, that would come later. That would arrive in letters from fathers and sermons from headmasters, and eventually, in the quiet moments of their own adult lives, when they'd ask themselves why they couldn't stop, why they kept choosing cold when warmth was possible, why comfort felt like failure, the ice answered before they even asked. The ice had been answering for years. The ice would keep answering until they were too old to feel it anymore. This was the logic, and once you accepted it, everything else followed. But the ice was only the beginning. The body was just the first classroom. The real lessons, the ones that would shape these boys for the rest of their lives, happened somewhere deeper, somewhere the cold couldn't reach, or maybe somewhere the cold made possible. Because once you've learned that your body can be ignored, that pain can be silenced, that the animal part of you that screams for warmth and comfort and safety can be overridden, something shifts inside you. The same machinery that lets you endure freezing water starts applying itself to everything else, to grief, to fear, to love, to every feeling that might, if you let it, reveal that you are soft, that you are weak, that you are not the man your father sent you here to become. And so the ice became a template, a practice run for the real work of erasing yourself. Let me tell you about a boy named Edward. Edward attended Eton in the 1880s, and we know about him because his daughter found his childhood diary after he died in 1946. She published excerpts, and those excerpts are the closest thing we have to a photograph of a soul being slowly frozen from the inside. Edward's mother died when he was 12. He was in his second year. The headmaster called him into his office on a Tuesday morning and told him the news in a voice that suggested he was delivering a Latin conjugation result. Edward walked back to his dormitory. He sat on his bed. He looked at the window, which was open, because it was always open, and then he took out his diary and wrote this. "Mama has died. The headmaster told me this morning. I was not able to attend lessons today, but I shall return tomorrow. One must carry on." That's it. That's the entire entry. No tears on the page. No shaking in the handwriting. No mention of the fact that he would never see her again. Never smell her lavender perfume. Never feel her hand on his forehead, checking for fever. Just, one must carry on. 3 days later, Edward asked permission to go home for the funeral. The housemaster said no. Not because Edward's father didn't want him there. Because the housemaster believed that attending a funeral would be too emotional, too indulgent. It would set a bad example for the other boys. It would suggest that personal grief was more important than duty and routine. So Edward didn't go. He stayed at Eton. He attended his classes. He ate his cold porridge standing up. He broke the ice in his basin every morning. And at night, alone in his freezing dormitory, he wrote this. "I played cricket today. It was a fine match. We won by 32 runs. I made 14 before being bowled out." And then, in smaller handwriting at the bottom of the page, so small you almost miss it, "I find I cannot remember Mama's face clearly anymore. Perhaps this is for the best." 12 years old. His mother just died. And he's already learned to see forgetting her as a blessing. Because remembering would mean feeling, and feeling was the one thing this place could not permit. Now you might think this was cruelty. You might think the housemaster who denied that funeral was a monster. But here's the thing that makes this whole system so insidious. The housemaster wasn't cruel. He was faithful. Faithful to a philosophy he'd absorbed at this same school 30 years earlier when his own mother died, and he wasn't allowed to go home either. Faithful to the belief that emotions were dangerous, that grief was weakness, that the only way to survive in a world that demanded constant strength was to cut away every part of yourself that could feel. He wasn't punishing Edward. He was saving him from the vulnerability that would destroy him later, out there in the empire where real dangers waited. At least that's what he told himself. That's what they all told themselves. And the boys learnt. God, how they learnt. They learned to keep their faces still when news arrived. They learned to speak in clipped tones about their own tragedies. They learned that crying was not just embarrassing, but dangerous, a sign that you might not make it, might not survive the training, might be sent home in disgrace. They learned to police each other's emotions more effectively than any master could. If a boy showed weakness, the others didn't comfort him. They mocked him, called him names. Molly was common. Baby was another. They'd learned that the worst thing you could be was soft, And they enforce that lesson on each other with the casual cruelty of children who've been taught that cruelty is kindness in disguise. One man, writing his memoirs in the 1920s, described being caught crying at age 13 after receiving a letter that his dog had died. The older boys in his house grabbed him, held him down, and literally forced his mouth into a smile, holding his cheeks until his face muscles cramped. "Smile, you little Molly," they kept saying. "Smile like a man." He never cried at school again. But he also wrote that he never really felt safe expressing any emotion again, not even happiness, because all emotions had become dangerous. All feeling had become evidence of failure. He'd learned the lesson so completely that he couldn't turn it off even when he wanted to. Even when, years later, his own children needed him to feel something with them. The machinery of suppression kept running, long after the reasons for it had faded. That's what the ice really did. It built a machine inside you that you couldn't dismantle. A machine that ran on its own power, using your own fear as fuel. And once it was built, once it was running, you belonged to it forever. Edward learned this. The boy who forgot his mother's face learnt it. Every boy in every photograph with that perfect blank expression learned it. They learned that feeling was failure, that grief was indulgence, that the only safe face was the one that showed nothing at all. And they carried that lesson into every relationship, every marriage, every moment when their children reached for them and found only a wall. The ice did its work. The ice always does. But here's the question that follows Edward's story. The one none of them could answer. What happened to all those feelings they never let out? Where did they go? The feelings didn't disappear. They couldn't. Human beings aren't built that way. You can't freeze grief or starve fear or beat loneliness out of a boy's bones. The feelings go somewhere. They find other exits. They leak out in ways the system never anticipated. Ways that seemed unrelated to emotion, but were driven by it entirely. And in Victorian England, those leaked feelings created something the headmasters never expected. They created a generation of men who couldn't feel but couldn't stop acting out what they'd suppressed. Men who turned their frozen interiors outward and built an entire culture around the performance of not caring. Men who invented new ways to suffer because suffering was the only feeling they still recognized as real. This is where we need to talk about something the Victorians never named, but we can see clearly from here. The numbness that followed the freezing wasn't peace, it wasn't strength, it was damage. And damaged men do damaged things. They hurt others the way they were hurt. They create hierarchies of suffering, where the goal is to prove you can take more than the next person. They turn cruelty into tradition and call it character building. The bullying we talked about, the older boys forcing younger boys to smile while their faces cramped, that wasn't random cruelty. That was passed down pain. That was boys who'd been frozen themselves now doing the freezing. That was the only way they knew to connect, through shared suffering, through proving together that they could endure anything, including each other. The system created a brotherhood of the numbed, and brotherhoods like that demand constant proof of membership, constant demonstrations that you still belong, constant rituals that remind you what happens if you leave. Think about what this meant for boys like Edward. He couldn't grieve his mother openly, couldn't cry, couldn't talk about her, couldn't keep her face alive in his memory, because remembering meant feeling, and feeling was forbidden. So what did he do with that grief? It didn't vanish. It went into his body. It showed up in the way he held himself, rigid and unmoving. It showed up in his perfect handwriting, every letter precisely formed, because losing control of your penmanship meant losing control of everything. It showed up in the insomnia that plagued him for years, documented in later diaries, nights when he lay awake in freezing dormitories staring at ceilings, not thinking about her exactly, but not able to sleep either. The grief became physical, became chronic, became the background hum of his entire existence. And he learned to call that hum normal, learned to call it manhood, learned to believe that this low-grade constant pain was just what it meant to be adult, to be responsible, to be the kind of man who could be trusted with empire. And the boys who couldn't contain it, the ones whose feelings leaked out in ways they couldn't control, they faced something worse. They faced the asylum. Because Victorian England had a place for men who broke. It wasn't a kind place. It wasn't a healing place. It was a place where the system admitted, quietly and behind high walls, that its methods sometimes failed. That some boys couldn't be frozen enough. That some men cracked instead of hardened. And in those asylums, the treatment was often more of the same. Cold baths, restricted movement, silence enforced. The very things that broke them were prescribed as cure, because the system couldn't imagine any other way, couldn't conceive that maybe the problem wasn't insufficient endurance but too much of it, couldn't see that the men in those asylums weren't weak but wounded by the very training that was supposed to make them strong. There's a record from a private asylum in 1892. A man admitted at age 34, former military officer, served in India for a decade, came home and couldn't stop. Couldn't stop the vigilance, couldn't stop the composure, couldn't stop performing the role even when there was no one watching. His family said he'd sit at dinner in complete silence, staring straight ahead, responding to questions with single words if at all. He'd wake at 4 a.m. and stand at attention by his bedroom window until dawn. He'd been doing it so long he'd forgotten why. The asylum diagnosis was neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. The prescribed treatment was bed rest and isolation, more silence, more aloneness, more of everything that had hollowed him out in the first place. He died there 5 years later. Cause of death listed as heart failure. But anyone reading between the lines knows what really failed. What really stopped working wasn't his heart. It was his ability to keep performing the man they'd made him. The mask finally cracked, and behind it, there was nothing left to save. This is what the ice really produced. Not strong men, not resilient men, but men who'd learned to hide their own humanity so completely that they lost access to it. Men who could function, yes, who could govern and command and endure, but who couldn't connect, couldn't vulnerate, couldn't say the words, "I need help," even when help was the only thing that might save them. The system worked exactly as designed. It created the perfect instrument for empire. And then it watched those instruments rust from the inside, unable to maintain themselves, unable to ask for maintenance, unable to do anything except keep functioning until they stopped. The tragedy wasn't that the system failed. The tragedy was that it succeeded. It did exactly what it set out to do. And what it set out to do was destroy something essential in boys so that something useful could rise in its place. The something useful was empire. The something essential was them. But here's what happens when you destroy something essential in enough people. It doesn't stay destroyed. It comes back. It comes back in ways you never expected. It comes back in the next generation. It comes back in the culture. It comes back in the quiet desperation of men who've inherited a way of being that was never meant for them. And that's where we're going next. Because the Victorian experiment didn't end when Victoria died. It just changed costumes. It moved into new buildings. It learned new language. But the ice kept flowing. The ice is still flowing. And you felt it. You felt it every time you told yourself not to complain. Every time you swallowed your own feelings because showing them felt like failure. Every time you envied the people who could just feel, just express, just be human without apologizing. That's the inheritance. That's what 1876 left in your bloodstream. And it's time to look at where it lives now. Thomas survived his 7 years at Harrow. He graduated, went to Oxford, and eventually became a colonial officer in India. The boy who broke ice with his fists at 11 became a man who governed thousands at 30. On paper, the system worked perfectly. Another success story. Another boy made good. Another proof that the freezing worked. But Thomas left something behind in those washrooms. Something he never quite recovered. And we know this because of a letter he wrote in his 30s, one of the last surviving documents in his hand. In it, he mentions almost casually that he still takes cold baths every morning. The water in India is warm, he writes, so he has his servants bring blocks of ice from the commissary. He breaks them himself. He washes in water cold enough to shock. It sets one up for the day, he wrote. He'd internalized it completely. The discomfort he'd once dreaded had become his chosen routine. He'd learned to love his chains. But here's what that letter doesn't say. What it can't say, because Thomas probably couldn't see it himself. The cold baths weren't just habit. They were compulsion. They were the only way he could still feel anything at all after years of training himself not to feel. The shock of ice against skin was the one sensation that penetrated the numbness. The one moment when he knew he was alive. Everything else, the governance, the relationships, the daily business of living, happened behind that wall he'd spent his youth building. His colleagues described him as capable but distant, efficient but cold. The kind of man who could make decisions without apparent emotion, which made him valuable to the empire. But also the kind of man who never quite connected with anyone, who married, yes, and had children, yes, but who his own daughter later described as a stranger who lived in our house and shared our name, but never our lives. The ice had done its work so thoroughly that Thomas couldn't find his way back to warmth, even when warmth was offered, even when his children reached for him, even when his wife, in rare, unguarded moments, tried to find the man behind the mask. There was no man there. Or rather there was, but he'd been frozen so long he'd forgotten how to thaw. This is the inheritance Thomas passed down, not just to his children though they felt it, not just to his grandchildren, though they inherited the same emotional distance, the same inability to say "I love you" without stiffening, but to a culture, to us, because Thomas's story didn't end in 1910 when he died. It continued in every boy who came after him. Every boy sent away to schools that still believed in cold water and hard beds. Every boy taught that feelings were weakness. Every boy who learned to equate masculinity with endurance and endurance with silence. The schools changed. The ice baths became optional, then rare. The language shifted, but the underlying philosophy, the belief that real men don't complain, don't struggle, don't need help, that philosophy didn't die. It just found new places to live. It lives in the gyms where men punish their bodies for hours and call it discipline. It lives in the offices where working through lunch, working through illness, working through burnout is still seen as dedication rather than destruction. It lives in the voice in your head that says you should be able to handle this alone, that asking for help is admitting failure, that everyone else is managing fine, so why can't you? That voice learned to speak in a freezing washroom in 1876. It's been speaking ever since, and it's still killing men. The suicide rates haven't changed in 150 years. Men are still 3 times more likely to die by their own hand than women. Still the single biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK. Still a crisis we talk about in statistics, while real men, actual flesh and blood men, with names and families and stories, disappear quietly, because they couldn't find a way to say, "I'm not okay," without feeling like they'd failed some fundamental test. Thomas would recognize them. He'd recognize the numbness, the isolation, the gradual realization that the wall you built to keep pain out also kept everything else out. He'd recognize the moment when you look at your own life and realize you've been performing it rather than living it. He'd recognize the cold, not the physical cold of ice water, but the deeper cold of a self you can't access anymore. The cold of knowing something essential was frozen out of you long ago, and you don't know how to get it back. Maybe you can't get it back. Maybe the ice did permanent damage. Maybe Thomas, standing in that Indian bungalow at 40, breaking ice with the same hands that broke it at 11, maybe he knew this. Maybe that's why he kept doing it. Not because it set him up for the day, because it was the only thing that still felt like anything at all. The Victorians taught us how to endure. They never taught us how to stop enduring, how to rest, how to feel, how to be human without apologizing for it. That part we have to figure out ourselves. That part is still waiting. And the question Thomas leaves us, the question every frozen boy leaves us, is whether we'll keep building walls or finally learn to let them melt. Whether we'll pass the ice to our children or find the courage to warm ourselves. Whether we'll be the generation that finally says enough. Enough cold, enough silence, enough dying alone, because we couldn't say we needed help. The choice is ours. The ice is waiting, but so is everything else.